I'm sitting in a tent and I'm having tea with, these Indians that are trying to climb the mountain, or with Ukrainians or Russians or all these different nationalities. And I'm keeping an open mind because I think I'm an open minded person, and I'm hearing their stories and I'm communicating with them and I'm looking right into their eyes, and we're talking about, our climbs and the weather and our families and everything. And it didn't take that long before I realized, you know what? These people are just like me.
This is A New Angle, and I'm your host, Justin Angle. This show is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Hey folks, welcome back. Today I'm excited to bring back to A New Angle legendary climber and New York Times bestselling author and fellow New Hampshire native Mark Synnott. Mark's new book, The Third Pole, documents the amazing story of his team's mission to solve one of the greatest mysteries of Mount Everest history, whether or not George Mallory and Sandy Irvine were the first people to stand on the summit. That mission is also captured in the amazing films Lost on Everest and the shorter edit, The Ghosts Above. It's a riveting story that confronts many of the dominant and oversimplified narratives associated with Mount Everest. Mark, really excited to have you back. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks. This is awesome. Thanks for having me, Justin.
So many things to congratulate you on: the climb, the films, the book. How does it feel to be kind of through the other side of it all?
Well, I think it will feel good once I'm fully on the other side, but I feel like I'm not quite there.
Sure.
And I'm actually right in the crux, really, of the whole thing, which is, launching the book and actually sharing it with everyone. And it feels a little bit overwhelming, actually, not as deeply satisfying as you might think. It's sort of weird in that climbing is kind of like that too. And you get to the summit and you project a lot onto it, and you always think that it's going to be this epic climax, but then you get there and usually you're just fried. And so it feels a little bit like that. The past, it's like almost 3 years now that I've put into this project.
Yeah, and then you situate that and, this time of COVID that we've been living through the last year or so, it's like a hard time to pause and celebrate and just take a breath. So I can imagine like just this push you've been in is, overwhelming seems like the right word.
Yeah, it does feel that way a little bit. And yeah, COVID has been good and bad for me. In some ways, I benefited personally because it made it easier for me to write because I wasn't going anywhere. And all of a sudden I was just at home and everything kind of dropped off my schedule. And so I just sat down here in my basement office cranking away day after day, which was kind of what you need to do. And it actually felt good to not be on the move so much. And for a bunch of years, I've been feeling like I needed to slow down and not travel as much and just take a break. I don't think it would have happened otherwise, but with COVID, a lot of us were forced into that. And I mean, it's been awful. And obviously, the world has paid a terrible toll, but there has been a little bit of a silver lining for me personally.
Indeed. I mean, I think for a lot of us, it's the simplicity of life, and just sort of forcing us to kind of reassess priorities and some, when you take some things off the table and off the menu, it's a little easier to force that. I think the obvious place to start with this conversation is, why Everest? I mean, I sort of feel like the cadre of climbers that you've sort of rolled with throughout most of your career probably looked at that mountain with some disdain for many years. What hooked you into trying to go after that objective?
Well, that's kind of a big part of the story, Justin, because I think you could almost call me an anti-Everest
Right.
guy for the majority of my career. And I never thought that I would go to Everest. Really, just was not on my radar. I came of age as a climber in the 1990s, which is, I think, sort of the era when Everest developed, this modern stigma that you're referring to. And myself and, my peers, the climbing tribe, that I was part of, a lot of us, especially the people that were, kind of in deep, were turned off by everything that we were hearing about Everest, and the idea that people were buying their way to the summit, and that the whole thing had become commercialized and had come to represent, all the things that climbing wasn't supposed to be about. In the 1980s, before the Everest guiding industry started, the mountain was the domain of, the best alpinists in the world, and all the expeditions were, you know what you might call just, private purist endeavors, where, people would spend like their whole career as climbers to sort of earn the right to climb the mountain or to be invited on one of those trips. And then all of that changed, and so that had a formative influence on the direction that I went with my climbing. And I think that's why I, part of the reason why I went for so many different sort of obscure climbs. Like if we listed them off, and, some of them I talked about in my first book, most people, like the lay person who's not part of the climbing world, wouldn't know anything about them, wouldn't have heard of them or anything like that. So it was kind of weird the way that it came about, but it was also part of why this trip ended up being so special. And I start the book with the genesis of this whole thing, but as you referenced in your sort of opening there, it was really the mystery that sucked me in. And I've always been kind of a student of history in general, but in particular of mountaineering and exploration history. And I have read, widely in that subject. Especially when I was a young climber, I read every classic climbing book I could get my hands on. But I had fastidiously avoided all the Everest sagas. And the reason why is because, I had just been so turned off by everything that I was hearing about it, when I was coming up through the ranks as a climber. And what happened was, a good close friend of mine who lives right near me here in Jackson, New Hampshire, was giving an Everest talk. And the subject was the 1999 expedition, which they found George Mallory. And he told that story in the talk, and it really captured my imagination, and it made me realize that I didn't know as much about Mallory and Irvine as I did about all other mountaineering history. And I remember going home and looking on my bookshelf, which is covered in mountaineering books, and I realized that I only had one Everest book, and it was Into Thin Air. And so it was almost like the modern Everest stigma had kind of created this situation where these guys that were should have been heroes of mine had been overlooked. And so then, as an adult, as an older, like, career kind of anti-Everest guy, I dove in and I started reading all of these books about Mallory and Irvine and about the early British Everest expeditions, and they totally captured my imagination in the same way that all the other stories, that I've always read about exploration have. And that's ultimately, kind of what sucked me in and changed, you know, the path that I was following.
Yeah. So maybe talk about like from there, from that interest being piqued to how the expedition itself came together. I mean, because you were at the time, I think your late 40s. The sort of notion of going on an Everest expedition at that stage of life, at that stage of career. Once the kind of hook of the history was set with you, how do you then kind of get to an expedition? I mean, you could have gone down the rabbit hole of trying to tell the story as an historian, but you'd made the decision to go to the mountain. Talk about that. Why were you determined to go? How did you sort of pull it off with family and a spouse, and sort of being, later in your career with more commitments on the home front than at other times? How did you make it happen?
Well, I think you're exactly right in saying that I could have approached the story from my armchair, so to
Right.
speak, just from the perspective of like academic perspective as a historian. And I'm not sure why exactly, but I like stories where the writer immerses themselves into it. I think I like reading those types of stories, and I also like being in them. A great example would be a book that I kind of got some inspiration from for this whole mission, which is The Lost City of Z by David Gran. So he's writing about Percy Fawcett and this search for this sort of fabled city of gold, but instead of just writing it from home, he actually goes down and searches and is able to put himself into the environment and sort of follow and Percy Fawcett's footsteps. And I really loved that model and kind of like that template for a book. And when I you know when I got sucked into the mystery, I just quickly asked myself that question. What would a journalist, a writer, do if they wanted to tell this story in that kind of immersive style? And it was plainly obvious that you would go to Mount Everest yourself and you would try to solve the mystery. And there was kind of a funny thing that happened at that point where that idea resonated deeply as soon as I had it. And it's weird that it did, because on the surface I'm supposed to be, not into Everest and kind of against all of it, but as a lifelong climber, I couldn't help but be intrigued by it.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole scene and everything you hear about it. But I also just kind of wondered, as someone who spent a lot of time in the mountains, what's it like up there? What's it like at 8,000 meters? What would it be like to be where Mallory and Irvine were? They were last seen at 28,200 feet on the Northeast Ridge. What would it feel like to be at 28,200 feet? What does it look like? And how does it feel? What does it sound like? How does it smell? That's sort of where my curiosity led me. And the thing is it was something that I had always been wondering about, because I had done all this climbing, but I had never been that high. And I obviously knew about it, and I knew other people who had, and I was intensely curious to know what that was like. And so I had to kind of battle through this thing where, I'm supposedly not into that and I don't want to climb this mountain. But once I let my guard down, even a little bit, I realized actually I I do want to go up there.
Yeah.
And when we first pitched the trip, the idea was, well, we're not going to try to climb the mountain. We're just going to go and try to solve the mystery. And won't it be kind of cool, as these sort of anti-Everest people, that we'd be up there and maybe we could summit, but we'll choose not to? And very quickly, I realized that that was all just a farce. And especially when I got there, and I remember the moment when we pulled into base camp, the whole mountain was totally covered in clouds and you couldn't see anything. It was actually kind of grim because it's just this like gravel floodplain at the snout of the Rongbuk Glacier, and it was snowing out. And the ground was covered in snow. I was like, wow, this is like pretty grim, windy. Like this is where I'm going to live, for the next like 6 weeks or whatever. And the clouds lifted out, and I came out of my tent. I saw the mountain for the first time, and yeah, I mean, it was absolutely stunning. But it had some kind of magnetic pull on my psyche, and I looked up there and I just thought, that's really intimidating. But I want to go there. I want to go up to the top. I want to see what that's like.
And that ends up being a big theme in the book, and in the films, is this dynamic with the support team, the local support team, and they're not necessarily on board with this idea of not going to the summit. Going to the summit for the guides and for the locals is a really big kind of career accomplishment, right? It puts them in a position to get hired on for more expeditions. Like, talk about that dynamic with the support crew.
All of that kind of hinged on the fact that we were in this kind of tricky position in that the Chinese don't really want people messing around with the mystery of Mallory and Irvine.
Okay.
And the reason is because they ultimately were the ones who made the first ascent of the Mallory and Irvine route, the Northeast Ridge. They were trying to do it in 1924. That route was eventually climbed in 1960 by the Chinese. And I've been told that the ascent represents, in Chinese culture, what the moon landing does here for us in the US. It's that big and that important a thing. And I go into all of this in the book, but as we were working all this out, we were told that that the Chinese wouldn't really look favorably on an expedition that was going to try to solve that mystery, because if you could somehow prove that those guys summited in 1924, it would, in some way, shape, or form, it would taint the Chinese ascent in 1960. Maybe taint's not the right word, but in the history books, there would have to be an asterisk that said, well, these were the first people to get up and down it alive. Somebody actually had made it to the top before. The same would be true, for the first ascent in 1953 by Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. And so we worded things specifically on our permit, like we're doing historical research, without laying it all bare. And then we had to communicate with the Sherpas as well, the climbing Sherpas, in terms of what the intentions were for the expedition. And I do go into this, and for people who want to know more about how all this went down, I would say, please read the book, because I describe it all carefully there. But the truth of the matter is that we told the Sherpas what the plan was. And that doesn't come out well in either of the films. But they did know the plan, okay? They did know the plan. But it wasn't in their best interest to be really forthright about it, because they knew that the Chinese didn't necessarily approve of what was going on. So there's some nuance there, and some layers to it that that didn't come out in the films. But the bottom line is that we, and I think myself personally, really benefited when this whole thing kind of came to a head, because our guide, Jamie McGinnis, who's a Kiwi veteran Everest guy, essentially told us we're not going to have enough time up high to search and go for the summit. And that was, something that we all kind of had to accept, but it was hard because I think by that point, a lot of us, the members of my team were getting summit fever, and that's when the Sherpa, said, "Hey, like we're not really down with that plan." And as I describe it in the book, that's when I kind of turned to Jamie and said, "Hey, like you did tell these guys like what we're all about, right?" And he was like, "Yeah, I did actually." And I believe that was the case. But they just said, "Hey, like, we're here to climb the mountain, and we we don't really like messing around with dead bodies on the mountain. That's kind of a taboo for us." And so in this kind of a cool way, we ended up in this position where we had to decide to go to the summit and then do whatever searching we were going to do on the way down. And I was secretly, silently, kind of pumping my fist under the table when this decision was made, because I'm like, oh, holy shit! Like now I actually, might be able to climb the mountain. But in terms of the whole idea of like the Sherpas being betrayed or anything like that, and I think it might have come across that way a little bit in one of the films, that was not the case.
A New Angle is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and UM's College of Business. Access to capital, broadband, and education are 3 ingredients any community needs for success.
Raging wildfires have scorched a record number of acres and killed at least 31
continues to climb from those devastating wildfires.
Last year, wildfires scorched a landmass nearly 5 times the size of Yellowstone National Park. It was the largest area burned since reliable records began. Fires are getting bigger and hotter and more devastating than ever before. But what all that fire means and what to do about it depends on who you ask.
The experience of a forest taking fire is really something.
Not only a gift to us, but it's more of a gift to the land.
There will always be fear of fire, I know that, and I don't pretend there won't be, but in certain situations there shouldn't be.
I'm Justin Angle, and for the last couple years, I've been talking to scientists, historians, and firefighters themselves to hear their stories.
You owe it to the guys that died.
I wanted to figure out, how did we get here?
We're going to knock fire out of the landscape.
Remember, only you can prevent forest fires.
It was a crazy ambition.
And where do we go?
It just, knowledge is freaking power.
I'll talk about it in a calm way, but this is me hitting the panic button.
Am I making any difference here with the science? That's what I wonder sometimes.
This is Fireline, a 6-part podcast series from Montana Public Radio and the University of Montana College of Business about what wildfire means for the West, our planet, and our way of life.
This is Meg Oliver, CBS News correspondent, and you're listening to A New Angle.
And so talk about, some of this decision-making and communication is happening along the way, and some of it's happening up high on the mountain, I would have to assume. Just talk about what it's like being up that high and, trying to communicate effectively, make good decisions, all sorts of issues that, when you're up that high under such stress, what does it feel like? How does it play out?
It's pretty, it's hard and stressful. We had 6 team members, and when it came down time to finally go up the mountain, by that point, we had lost 3 of them to, sort of various problems. One guy got some pulmonary emboli early on in the trip and had to bail out, so we lost him. My partner, the guy who kind of inspired the whole thing, Tom Pollard, had some kind of weird neurologic incident where he got facial paralysis right before we were supposed to head up to the summit. And then Jim Hurst, who was the sound guy for the film and was one of the strongest members of our team and had previous high altitude experience, something weird happened to him, and we don't know what. But when we got to the North Col, he had to drop out. So it's sort of like a war of attrition that you go through on Everest to get to the point where you would set off for the summit. And when we finally got to that point, I felt like, wow, you have to actually be kind of lucky to kind of run the gauntlet and get through everything and not get sick or hurt. And when the day comes and you get your weather window to actually be, healthy and fit enough to do the climb. The other part about it, that I hadn't really anticipated, that once you start the climb, it's incredibly difficult to eat and to sleep. And I am not exactly sure. I know I ate a little bit, but I might not have slept at all the entire way. And let's see, it's 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 days round trip. And I slept after we made it to the top, and I don't even know if you could call it sleep. It was more like unconsciousness.
Sure.
But
coma.
But on the way up, I don't know if I even really dozed off at all, and I couldn't eat, and I had no appetite, and I'd heard all about that, from people, but for me, it was a very real thing, and I couldn't even take a bite of anything. I was forcing myself to just ingest a little bit of calories, but I couldn't do it. And I would actually, I threw up from forcing myself to eat. The food was that nauseating to me. So basically, you're under a tremendous amount of stress, and that makes everything more difficult. But what it did for me was it just made me realize how remarkable it was what the British were doing back in the 1920s, in the days before high altitude alpinism really even existed as a human endeavor. They were basically inventing it as they went. And as everyone knows, the equipment that they had in the 1920s was appalling. Part of the research that I did for the book was I went to the Royal Geographical Society in London, and I saw a lot of the artifacts, including Mallory's boot. And it straight up looks like the kind of boot that you would wear, going hiking in Colorado in the summer. And the thought of like climbing that high, not even using crampons, they just had little hobnails in the boot. I saw the rope, which was not even what I would call a clothesline. Skinnier than my pinky, about about as thick around as a Bic pen, and it's made out of flax. You could pull hard on it and just part it. And of course, the clothing that they were wearing and all of that, that was what sucked me into the story initially, was just thinking about the spirit that those guys must have had. Mallory himself called it the spirit of adventure. And I really wanted to learn more about that spirit. And that kind of goes back to what you were asking me about, immersing myself in the story. There's no better way to appreciate that than to go up there and actually follow in their footsteps, but also to be up there with all of these modern day Everest climbers, and they're the ones that we're all kind of told that in the media that we need to hate, because they're bad people and they're doing it for the wrong reasons and they're ruining the mountain and they're trashing it, all that. But I couldn't help but tip my hat to them. There was one expedition on the mountain which was all underprivileged Indian teenagers who essentially had no mountaineering background at all. They got chosen out of these schools, I think, in southern India, and went through a course and then just went to Everest. And those kids were up there, and they were doing the climb. And you might sort of say, like, sitting from your armchair at home, like, this is insane. Like, what are they doing? Like, and I would think that myself. But then I was up there, climbing side by side with these kids at times and just thinking, wow, like, hats off, you guys. Like, you got a lot of grit.
Sure. Getting after it.
Credit, give some credit where credit is due. And you know what? A lot of them summited. And I know personally how hard that is. So I was really impressed by that.
Yeah. So maybe talk a little bit more about some of those. We started the conversation talking about some of these sort of dominant, oversimplified narratives. I mean, talk about how your view of the peak and all those narratives changed. You've mentioned some of it, but specifically, what changed your mind during this trip?
Well, I think that one of the main takeaways that I had in terms of modern day Everest is that I don't look down on these people anymore who want to climb Everest. I think that's a really popular thing to do nowadays. I mean, I see stuff about this on the media all the time. And, last year was a disastrous year on Everest. There were 11 deaths. And just to put that in perspective, in 1996, which was, the famous tragedy that Krakauer wrote about in Into Thin Air, there were 8 deaths. So there are actually more people who died in 2019 than there were in 1996. And then there was also that viral photo that anybody who has access to the internet pretty much saw, or anyone who consumes media saw the picture of the conga line, right? With all the people. I'm sure you saw it, like everybody in the world did. And you saw the headlines, that went along with it. And they all just sort of paint a picture of, the people that are trying to climb Everest as a bunch of selfish jerks.
Right.
And quite honestly, I mean, I know a lot of people think that, and I thought that because that's what I was told. That's how it is. And so I kind of went into it thinking, okay, well, that's, who I'm going to be rubbing shoulders with on the mountain. And then, I'm sitting in a tent and I'm having tea with, these Indians that are trying to climb the mountain, or with Ukrainians or Russians or all these different nationalities. And I'm keeping an open mind because I think I'm an open-minded person, and I'm hearing their stories and I'm communicating with them and I'm looking right into their eyes, and we're talking about, our climbs and the weather and our families and everything. And it didn't take that long before I realized, you know what? These people are just like me. They're just normal, cool people, and they saved up their money and they want to do something big, and they don't seem to me like they're just driven by their ego. They want to have a sublime experience in the mountains. That's kind of what I saw, and I think that's actually the same spirit that Mallory and Irvine had. This is not to say that it's not a screwed up situation when you have 11 people dying and the whole conga line. Like, that's a problem that needs to be fixed, I think. And I go deep into this, and I do a lot of reporting on this in the book, and I have a chapter in there that's called The Day Everest Broke. And it's sort of the story behind that viral photo. Like, what was really going on? Because that was happening on both sides of the mountain, on the Chinese side and on the Nepal side. And what happened in 2019 is that the weather was terrible. You can only climb Everest when the jet stream basically releases its grip from the summit. Essentially, I think the jet stream shifts to the north. When the monsoon comes up, for complicated reasons, the jet stream kind of moves out of the way, and then the wind will drop and you can go to the summit. I think it was, 2018. I think this is right. The year before, that summit window, so when the jet stream moved away and it's okay to go up, the summit window was 11 days. In 2019, it was 1 day. And so when it's 11 days, all the outfitters, they can coordinate and they can say, hey, when are you going? Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes sense. We'll go the next day, or we'll go the day before you, or we'll go 2 days later because the weather window looks really good. So let's spread ourselves out. And that's why you didn't hear very much about 2018, because it was a good year on Everest and not that many people died. 2019 was a really bad year. And as a result, really bad year weather-wise. As a result, everybody had to go to the summit at the same time. The thing that people need to understand is that nobody wanted to be in that line.
Sure.
They got dealt a shitty hand, and they had no choice. And it was either that or, not attempt to get to the summit that year. So that is a problem that I think will be hard to prevent, but I think it has more to do with the management of the mountain in terms of how many permits are going to be given out by the Chinese and the Nepalese versus something that you would put onto the shoulders of the people who want to climb the mountain itself. The mountain is kind of getting trashed as a result. That's a problem that needs to be fixed. And that's sort of a deep subject, but not all of the people up there are doing that. Like our team, for example, we took everything down off the mountain that we brought up. And there were a lot of other expeditions that did. There were some that didn't, and they left their stuff up there. That's a problem that needs to be fixed. There's a lot of now newer discount Everest outfitters who are offering up the chance to climb Everest for like a much smaller price tag, and they seem to be less stringent in terms of who they're going to allow on the mountain. I think that's wrong, and you should have to submit a resume and be someone who has the qualifications to climb the mountain. But ultimately, there were a lot of people up there who didn't have those qualifications, these Indian kids, for an example. And, I don't know if I'd personally say to them, no, you shouldn't be here and you can't do this. Because I don't know. I kind of like the idea that there aren't any rules. I think that should be fixed, but at the same time, I didn't hold it against those people personally. So I guess what I'm saying in a convoluted way is that, it's right that there should be some haters because there's a screwed up situation going on up there. But I think, more of it should be directed at kind of the management of the whole business, kind of what I call Everest Incorporated, and less animus towards the climbers themselves who, my experience having actually been there with the mountain is that they're good people.
Yeah. That's important nuance, is that you can't put it on the individuals stacked up in that conga line. They're all responding to the incentives in front of them, the reality of the weather, the constraints of the management system. And you can't just say that because they're there, they're bad people or just, single-minded, privileged, buying their way to the summit. All those narratives, I think, are much more complex than we think. And, being there must have been, you're there and you're kind of a part of it at the same time. Must have been a surreal experience to kind of be experiencing all that high altitude world, but also your mind has to be swimming, sort of thinking about all these new people you're meeting, as well as like the reality being much more rich and complicated than what you had thought.
Yeah, most things in life are like that,
Indeed.
I thought it was, going to be a bunch of lawyers and CEOs, and that kind of thing. And I mean, most of the people that I met were just scrappy dreamers who didn't have a lot of money, who saved up, to go and do it. So the reality on the ground was a little different, than what I was expecting. And one of the things that I wanted to do with this book was I wanted to have, the main narrative really is kind of the historical piece interwoven with me, my first person modern day story of following in their footsteps to try to figure out what really happened back in 1924. But because I'm actually up there and climbing the mountain in 2019, I wanted to paint a portrait of what Everest is today. And it's I think it's it's a multi-layered thing. I personally found really fascinating to report on and to share with the readers. And sort of my early readers of the book isn't out, but there's been enough people now who have read it. A lot of them have said that they're finding the modern day narrative, this portrait that I paint of Everest to potentially be more compelling, than the historical piece.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm tearing through it. I can't put the thing down, and it's much like this podcast, Mark. Like you go into these complicated stories thinking that, or these oversimplified stories, thinking the story has to be much more complicated than it is. And your book does a great job of bringing that to life. I'm excited for you. I'm excited for it to hit the shelves. I'm excited for our listeners to get a chance to share in the story as well. It hits the shelves next week. Both actual and virtual. Where would you want to point people who want to get the book and experience it?
I would say to people that they could grab it anywhere where they buy books. Whether it's their local bookstore or any of the online retailers. The audiobook or the ebook, or just a copy of the hardcover. If anybody wants a signed copy, which is kind of a tricky thing to do in COVID, basically you and me talking, like, this is my book tour. Last time, I traveled all over the US meeting people in person and signing books. But there is a bookstore here in North Conway, New Hampshire, where I live, where I'm going to go in and sign a bunch of books. So if somebody wanted a signed copy, you can purchase it from White Birch Books in North Conway. And I hope people check it out. That's the whole point, obviously, in telling the story, is to share it with other people. I didn't do it just for myself. I want to share it with you and with as many other people out there who are interested. And I hope they will be. And the response has been super positive. So I think this is potentially worth people's time if the subject matter is something they're interested in.
Indeed. Well, Mark, good luck getting through this last sort of big push of the project, the promotion of the book. I know how you have mixed feelings about that piece of it, and I appreciate you freeing up some time to share the story with our listeners. Yeah, and maybe this summer we can actually connect in person in New Hampshire. That'd be fun.
I was just thinking that I still have not ever been face to face with you, even though we've had these conversations and then we've had other ones off the record. So I feel like we have a kindred spirit, but we've never actually hung out in person. So I think that does need to happen.
Well, let's get it done. Yeah, and hopefully it'll be a more settled down time where we can each sort of pause and reflect.
That sounds good. Well, I'll look forward to that.
Thanks for listening to A New Angle. We really appreciate it. And we're coming to you from Studio 49, a generous gift of UM alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. A New Angle is presented by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business, with additional support from Consolidated Electrical Distributors and Drum Coffee. AJ Williams is our producer. VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks made our music, and Jeff Meese is our master of all things sound. If you have any questions, suggestions, comments, insults, whatever, please email me at anewangle@umontana.edu. If you liked what you heard, tell your friends about it. Thanks a lot. See you next time.